Welcome, everybody. Unfortunately, we have a slightly diminished panel because Meena Kandaswamy was unable to make it due to last-minute illness, and that rather reduces, in some ways, some of the issues that we wanted to talk about, because she is a Tamil poet from a Dalit community in Tamil Nadu, a great writer and a fascinating person and activist who very powerfully challenges a great many things in Indian politics and life. And unfortunately, we're not going to have her. I hope to get her back at some stage to talk, but she's a really wonderful writer. But we do have two excellent guests who are going to talk about art and politics from the margins. Now, when I was trying to come up with ideas for this conference, this was something I very much wanted to focus on, although it's been surprisingly difficult in some ways to pull together. We wanted to include sort of voices and ideas from other communities, and particularly the most marginalized communities. And there are those who are, by virtue of often poverty, political exclusion, a whole number of things, are very much excluded from the sort of mainstream voices. Now, this university does and has tried to make certain efforts through its Roma Access program, through the new Olive initiative to reach out to refugees, to address some of the interests of some of the most marginalized people. But I have to say that academia in general has a very poor record on this. For all of the obsession that academics have in analyzing power, they're often very keen on sort of embracing power structures and very rarely actually challenge them. And I think in many ways in our society it's much more likely to be artists and others who do that. Academia has its own set of power structures and hierarchies and all the rest of it, and tends to work very hard on protecting its boundaries and keeping people excluded. You see this in everyday language that academics tend to use in the way we frame social sciences, in the way we frame policy discussions. It's often more about exclusion than anything else. So we're going to talk today to two people who have worked on trying to break down that exclusion and find ways to work with marginalized communities in a way I think that we can all learn from. And we're going to hear a lot about sort of practical experiences of how you can do that. I think particularly for future policymakers and others who deal in public policy issues, finding ways to enhance participation, finding ways to listen and to reach into different communities, and particularly the most marginalized communities, is enormously important. And we have not put enough emphasis in some ways on how arts can help us do that. So we're going to start off today with Eszter Pasztor, who works with Roma communities all around Europe, and she's going to talk through her project and show us some slides. Apologies for the lighting issue, it's just very difficult in this room.
Well, hello everybody. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that I work with Roma communities all over Europe. In actual fact, I work with one tiny Roma community in the northeast of Hungary. Really, excuse me, it's really the back of beyond. It's a tiny village of 230 people now. There used to be 170 of them when we started this project, called the Budvatenke Fresco Village Project. This village is 95% Roma, living in extreme poverty, caused by lack of jobs and lack of infrastructure and being totally segregated. It's right on the border. When I first visited this village, it was absolutely gray and desolate. The people were totally hopeless. It was not a community, because dire poverty, when you really don't know what you're going to feed to your children in the evening or whenever, is not really conducive to building a strong community. It really seemed hopeless. And when I went there, for the first time, there was a man who took me there, who knew this community, and he said that, look, there is this lady from Budapest, and she'd like to help you. And then people surrounded me and said, please give us work. Well, no infrastructure, no properly trained labor force, no nothing. How could anybody think about giving work to them? But anyway, about 2 years later, the idea arose that something should be done to focus the attention of the majority population to the achievements of Roma people. We are talking about 2008, 2009. That was the time when a series of murders were committed against Roma people. You may have heard about that. Even in the mainstream press, all you heard about Roma people was that they are poor, they're aggressive, they're lazy, they do nothing but await state benefits and all that. And no positive news about them at all anywhere. And so the idea arose that we should invite Roma painters to paint murals on the walls, at first from Hungary only, and then from all over Europe. So we had Scottish Roma and German Roma and Serbian Roma and half Spanish, half Ukrainian, and German, and I don't know what that. So we now have 33 gigantic murals. The idea, the goal with this was twofold. There was the global objective of fighting prejudice with the help of art. Because these pictures, and that's now from experience I can say, truly elicit the admiration of the majority population. Not all the pictures can be seen on these slides, and anyway, you can hardly see them in the slide. So if you really want to see them, you have to come there. So that was the global perspective. But locally, we wanted to use the power of art to raise this, or rather, to enable this community to elevate themselves out of dire poverty. Now, obviously, tourism was the first means because people hear about these pictures, then come to the village, and yes, the people could then benefit by feeding them, by selling them the baskets that they make or other things. But in order to do that, we had, in addition to having the painters paint the murals, we had to do a hell of a lot of work. First of all, there was a part of the village, I'm telling you this because that's fairly typical in those parts of the country, where people were given building permits to build houses on land which was really a swamp. In that part of the country, Roma people very frequently get building permits for pieces of land which are regularly flooded. Now, the houses that I'm talking about were built then about 10 years before, and they were about to collapse. The water table was so high that you couldn't have even these outdoor toilets because the water would push up all the filth. So conditions, particularly in the summer, were horrible, with various diseases like diarrhea and worse. So that had to be done away with, and luckily that was about the only state funding that we got. we did receive money to relocate those people into refurbished houses inside the village. And then we pulled down those houses and created a place where now we organize festivals every year. Then we had to do a hell of a lot for community building. The women were instrumental in that. We formed a women's circle where we invited so-called interesting people every week to talk to them. And then they started coming together out of their own initiative, discussing what to do with the kids, what they cooked, whatever problems they had. One day we invited 2 Turkish students, girls, to talk to them about life in Turkey. Can you imagine that? These people have hardly left that village and certainly have not been to even Budapest, so getting foreigners to come there, it was quite an experience for them. And they asked them to sing folk songs. So they sang some Turkish songs and asked the women to do the same. But they said, oh no, we can't sing and all that. But anyway, they did. And they realized they can sing and that it is nice to sing together. The result was that they formed the women's choir, performing regularly in the village. Then they began to get invitations to go elsewhere, and they even went to the European Parliament in Brussels to sing their bit to European MPs to call their attention to the fact that, yes, it is worthwhile dealing with the Roma problem. We worked a lot with the children. That was perhaps the most important thing to do. We had a Steiner teacher, Waldorf, known by other names, who with absolute self-devotion came to work with the children in the village. And I must say that there we had our greatest measurable success. When we started the project in 2009, we had 28 primary school-aged children. Out of them, 24 failed in class, so that they had to repeat the year. By academic year 2013-14, we had 38 primary school children, and only one of them had to sit an exam in order to be able to go to the next year's class, and she managed as well. One could say that that's a success story. Unfortunately, it is not, because by now our new public education law has taken full force. The result being the children are being literally pushed out of school. You may know that the mandatory schooling age has been decreased to 16. And what is really horrible is that if you have your 16th birthday while still doing the last year in primary school, that's the 8th, which happens very easily in those parts, because they usually start school at the age of 7, and if you fail once in your career, then you will easily be 16 before finishing the 8th year primary school. And once you reach that birthday, you cannot go back to school. You cannot finish that. And if you don't finish primary, you can't get a driving license. You can't go in for any skilled laborer training. You're finished. That's the end of you. And unfortunately, that situation is hitting quite a few of our children. Then another important point was that we managed to set up Sure Beginning or Sure Start Children's House. This is, the methodology for this was developed in the UK, and it seems to me that it's perhaps the best method of integration that you can get. This is a kind of a kindergarten where mothers and their babies aged 0 to 3 attend together. And while the focus is on the early development of the babies, the mothers acquire various skills like cooking more healthily, like cash management, like gardening, like how to play with the children. The children learn the nursery rhymes and songs and whatnot. The children of the majority population also know. So when they get to kindergarten, they are, oh yes, and it's also very important, there is a bathroom where they can not just bathe, and the women can also take shower, but they can also learn how to use running water, how to use appliances that they do not have in their homes, like a microwave or oven or things like that. There are 2 automatic washing machines and dryers, which they can use. I have not told you that there are only 7 houses in the entire village with running water inside. So that shows how important these facilities are. And so it becomes evident for the children how to use a bathroom, that you sit down when you eat and the table is laid and you use a napkin and things like that. These are incredible disadvantages for children from such poor communities when they are thrown into the kindergarten and they have never used a toilet before. They have, I believe you can understand that from this. So these are the good points. But we have not been able to get investment funding, even though there were EU funds for this purpose plenty. Unfortunately, all our applications were turned down. The obvious thing would have been to build up tourist infrastructure. Even without any serious marketing effort, because we had no funding for this, and whatever I could do, I did, but that was very little. But even without proper marketing, we get 5,000 to 6,000 tourists a year at least, sometimes more. But the village hardly benefits from this because there is no restaurant, no guest house, no nothing. Well, then we try to turn this horror situation to our advantage by training a group of women of about 12, 15 to cook for tourist groups who let us know in advance that they are coming. And so they've gained quite a name at how excellent cooks they are, but the best thing about it is that these tourists, usually middle-class people, largely from Hungary, but also from abroad, these are people who have never yet sat down to the table of a Roma woman. And this brings people together. There are real exchanges between them, and particularly biased Hungarians who come there, they very often admit afterwards that, oh my God, I'm really scared about visiting a Roma village. What's going to happen? Are they going to pick our pockets? Are they going to beat us? Are they going to throw stones at our car? What's going to happen? And then they find that there is a community, really kind, really hospitable, that they have an excellent sense of humor. Yes, they speak differently, but it's so funny. And the children are beautiful and really kind. And somehow nobody leaves Budvatenke the way they came. The village has really become a very important venue of meaningful intercultural dialogue. And it works both ways, because the people in this village have been totally segregated by distance, by geography, by lack of infrastructure, everything. Through meeting aliens, I mean, all these middle-class people, they started talking. We get very many students who come to us. Many of them say that spending some time in Budvatenke, which could be anything from a day to a couple of weeks, it's been their really formative experience. The world has begun to open up. In fact, even the painting of these murals themselves was an incredibly forming event in the village. I mean, all these painters are highly qualified people. Most of them teach arts in any case. And while they were working, people surrounded them, they started talking, and it was opening up new vistas, new horizons. Then we started taking groups to Budapest. There was one university community that every month took 3 or 4 Budvatenke teenagers to Budapest, and they showed them the university library, the lecture rooms, showed them all these sort of things, because they could not even imagine what it could be like having a different kind of life. I mean, in the village, the highest educational achievement was this 8 years primary school. Last year, we had hoped to get the first A-level, but unfortunately, after the written examination, she chickened out and didn't dare to go to the oral. So, in spite of all the help that we gave her, but she did not believe that she could do it, and there she was crying and didn't go in. Anyway, she'll try again next year, hopefully. About the festival, there's the Dragon Festival. It was a dragon because we wanted a symbol that could somehow tie up cultural tourism, arts, culture, and ecotourism. So we invented this dragon that lives in the swamp surrounding the village. And every year, usually the first weekend of July, we invite really excellent, largely Roma, but not only Roma, musicians, poets, theaters, etc., to show how rich Roma culture is, how rich Roma art can be. And because of the excellence of these actors, we draw 2 kinds of audience. The poor Roma people from the surrounding villages, and the urban middle class. And it's again the 2 kinds of people who don't normally meet, but there they do. They enjoy each other's company. Just a little scene comes to my mind when a banker, a member of the Monetary Council, came to this event, and Auntie Olga, 60-plus-year-old Roma lady, asked him to dance, this rather strict-faced banker, and he loved it. He really did. And that's how it goes there. Unfortunately, this year, we got no funding for this festival. We'll still have it, but we won't be able to pay the musicians. So it will be a dragon picnic, if you like. It will be held on 8th of July, that's a Saturday, and you're very welcome to attend. It would still be a very, very nice event. That's the 6th Dragon Festival. In earlier years, this was a 2 or 3 day festival, and many say that this has become the most prestigious and highest niveau world music festival in north of Hungary. All this seems fantastic. The only trouble is that when we began this project, per capita average monthly income was 16,000 forints, divided by about 300, and then you get the euro figures. This went down to 8,000, in fact less than 8,000, in the winter of 2013, when there was absolutely nothing available in terms of work, not even seasonal work, no public work either. There was such starvation in the village, in spite of the fact that we managed to distribute some food at the end of every month, that 7 women became pregnant that winter. Of those 7 pregnancies, 4 babies died, either being born dead or dying a couple of days after being born. It is incredible to have such starvation in the middle of Europe, in an OECD country, one of the richest 35 countries in the world, into which incredible amounts of EU funds are flowing. Now the situation is a little bit better because of public work, which means that you don't have 10, 15 days of starvation at the end of each month, only a few. So we are back to about the 16,000 forints average income. But in the meantime, since 2009, the inflation hitting them, well, I'm not an economist, so it's rather difficult for me to estimate the inflation that hit them, but there was an incredible rise in energy prices, in flour, in potato, in cooking oil prices. All these went up by at least 50-60%, and they spent literally almost nothing on anything other than paying the electricity bills, the communal tax, and food. Undernourishment is horrible. You may have seen in these photos, I mean, if you have, that there are 2 types of people in Budvatenke, the extremely fat and the extremely thin. Both of them are caused by undernourishment, because all they get to eat is pasta, bread, and fat. Very little fruit, hardly any vegetables. The situation has improved a lot because we've introduced gardening to the village. Roma people traditionally engaged in the breeding of animals, not in gardening. And stupid intellectual from Budapest, in the first spring, I bought a whole lot of seeds and distributed them that go and till your gardens. Well, there was Toshu, who put out all the lettuce seeds in an area that size. So he had 200 lettuces that size. So I realized that that doesn't work that way. Just because somebody lives in the country does not necessarily know how to till a garden. I don't know how to do it either, but then. So the next spring, I bought a horticulturalist who taught them how to plant, how to tend to those plants. And now I'm proud to say that with one exception who will not, all the others have really nice gardens, some of them more successful than others. But even that is not a full success story, because a few years ago, a dam was built around the village, and somehow that was misplanned. On one side of the village, you have this swamp I talked about, which is actually one of the most valuable and beautiful swamps in Hungary. It's really a fantastic experience to go in there. You have the most fantastic plants and animals living there, so quite interesting. And there are hills on the other side. Now the dam prevents the water to run into the swamp, which flowed down from the hills, which means that very often the water table rises so high, particularly when there are such heavy torrential rains, that everything rots, so their efforts are not really repaid. And the worst of it is the failure of our job creation schemes. One was a small tailoring plant. We had a few women who used to work in a tailoring plant in a neighboring town. Unfortunately, that tailoring plant was moved to the Ukraine because wages are cheaper there still. But anyway, we had these few skilled women. So I managed to get ancient industrial sewing machines and got the first order, which was sewing protective clothing for welders, which had to meet 3 European standards, and they had to use special materials and thread, which would not burn, which is much more difficult to handle, but they worked like angels. The plant failed because out of our 3 sewing women, 2 were diagnosed with cancer. So the plant could only operate for about 5 months. The other one, the other major job creation scheme, was our bio project. We had a social cooperative, and we signed contracts, framework contracts with neighboring forest owners to manage their forests for them, so do all the work that you need to do to keep the forest healthy, but not against cash, but against the wood waste that is generated in the meantime. And also had framework contracts with 3 power plants, 1 in Miskolc and 2 in Slovakia, to sell them the ground wood, which is an excellent fuel. We would have needed some machinery to do this efficiently. We did apply again for EU funds. Applications, the evaluation of the applications was late, but then the managers of the Miskolc power plant rang me and, come on, are you going to supply that ground stuff or what? So I called the men together and I said, shall we take the risk? I mean, this can be done even without much machinery. It's much more difficult, but shall we try? And in the meantime, perhaps we get the funding and then we can do it better. They did take on the risk, and the cooperative officially employed 12 men who did the work. I could only buy one saw for them. But over the 4 months of their operation, they built up a pile about 800 meters long, 4 meters high, 6 to 8 meters wide, out of these branches that they collected in the forest. But I could not rent a grinding machine. And the situation was always the same. I agree with a business that they send me the grinding machine. They come and survey the place. We agree that the machine will be sent on Tuesday. Well, as you didn't come on Tuesday, so did the grinding machine not come. Then the snow fell and started melting immediately, which made forest paths impassable for large machinery, but not for small tractors. Now you need to know that Roma people are frequently accused of stealing wood, and it's a rightful accusation because they really cannot afford to buy firewood. And if they don't want to freeze to death, then they need to get firewood the way they like. But this time, there is a village, full Hungarian, not a single Roma living there. The inhabitants all are small forest owners. Well, at night, they went up with their small tractors to this huge pile that our people put together and took out all the large bits, which were the most valuable, which contained the most materials. So by the time the paths became passable again, the size of the pile shrank to about a third of its original size. And when I went to the police asking them, come on, I mean, they're stealing the wood of the Roma, said, oh, we are sorry, it's not written on a branch that it's where it comes from, and all these people are forest owners. They can all say that they got that wood from their own little forests, the forest parts. So the result was that we did not manage to realize any sales revenue from this project. And finally, our application was also turned down. So this had to be stopped. But I had to take out a loan to be able to pay the man. Luckily, this loan has now been repaid. But just another little note. When this was the time when newspapers first started writing about the VAT fraud cases. You may, some of you are from Hungary, you may recall that people have been cheating on their VAT payments going up to billions. The first, when I first, after the first month, I did not have enough money to pay all the taxes and levies that you have to pay on wages. I paid about 2/3, but 1/3 was still missing. You've got to pay these taxes on the 12th of each month. I got a letter from the tax administration dated the 18th that the social cooperative is fined 5,000 forints because we failed to pay that remaining 30% of what had been due at the time. That's just a note. Right now, I would very much like to continue with this project, but I have a suspicion that so long as there is no major change in the budget, in the distribution of public funds, in government priorities, we will not be able to get ahead. The Public Education Act works against us. The fact that we cannot have access to EU funding really destroys our efforts. So it is now a very, very difficult situation. And so we just do not really see, we are looking for an angel investor right now. Perhaps, because if we could have a restaurant in the guest house, then that would create quite a few jobs, and then perhaps more would come.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting, although it's depressing to... It does make you realize how difficult it is to make sustainable changes in the light of government policies that have kept people very much on the margins. And it's quite shocking to hear some of these things, as you said, in a relatively wealthy country in the heart of Europe, to sort of hear of this level of poverty. Right, now we're going to turn to William Stirling and hear more about your work in both Africa and the Middle East.
Thank you. I believe most of you have probably seen the film that we were showing here, Queens of Syria, about what we did with women, Syrian refugee women in Amman. The project and the reason we got into this line of, or this approach, kind of drama therapy with a really good performance at the end of it, was by accident in a way, because we were engaged by Marks and Spencer's 4 years ago to help them with their corporate social responsibility angle, which was they have an enormous partner in East Africa who grows all their and packs all their vegetables, called VegPro. And they had engaged a very small NGO called Emerging Leaders to try and help the lot of their packers, most of the vegetable packers who work in this huge factory beside Nairobi Airport, live in slums, and a large proportion of them lived in Dandora, which hosts Africa's largest open-air rubbish tip, which is spectacularly enormous. And this rubbish tip encroaches into the slum on a daily basis. It's growing every day. So in addition to poor housing, there's a very, very poor health around there as well. Of course, a great lack of opportunity if you're not lucky enough to have a job in somewhere like VegPro. Emerging Leaders is a very interesting concept because it was started by a chap who used to do motivational speaking for the sort of high-flying middle executives of companies like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, to teach them how to become the leader of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. I wouldn't describe these people as marginalized necessarily, except perhaps self-marginalized. The lesson he worked out was that the same rules applied for the top 0.0001% of the world also applied in a very different way to the bottom 0.0001% of the world. And the lesson was very simple. no one is going to help you. You are going to have to do this yourself. Don't rely on your local council to build you a school. Don't rely on your chief to help you dig a well. Don't rely on anyone in power to help you, because you are right at the bottom of the pile, and you're right at the bottom of the list of priorities. Emerging leaders went to places like Dandora, and they'd been engaged by VegPro, who discovered that the byproduct of people going through, and I'm not sure this is entirely their intention, but they discovered that the byproduct of their vegetable packers going through, and particularly most marginalized workers going through the program, was that productivity rose by 72%. But in reality, I do believe that they didn't just do this for those reasons. We were asked to help to put dramatic content into a series of training films which were going to be seen by all 750,000 employees of VegPro. And so we decided to do a sort of mini-soap to thread in between all the training films. And I basically ripped off The Simpsons. There was a functional family next door to a dysfunctional family, and the dysfunctional family had all the problems of poverty and disease, etc., particularly in East Africa. And the functional family was a working family and traditional. Of course, I don't know what it's like working in Dandora, so I said to VegPro, I can't write this. I live in a basement in Kensington. I will need to workshop this with the people who actually live in Dandora. And they said, that's fine, because your cast all live in Dandora, and they formed an amateur dramatic group, and they'll help you write through what needs to be written and what's culturally appropriate and not appropriate. And so I met up, or my wife and I met up with the cast, and we started filling in the gaps of the structure I'd laid out. And they were extremely enthusiastic. And I discovered that they'd all been through this program. And some of them had jobs at VegPro, and some of them had no jobs at all. Dandora is not the most violent slum around Nairobi, but it certainly is not a pleasant place to live. And I sort of, in between, being incredibly impressed by the way they learned their lives, by the way they came up with scenarios, by the way they helped the whole dramatic process. And indeed, when we start moving into filming it, I was directing it, how incredibly quick they were to learn, and how incredibly enthusiastic they were, and any new opportunity thrown them at all, they grabbed, whether that was to be the continuity person or whether lots of little extra jobs we had. We only had 2 or 3 other people there. The assistant director, quite a smarty pants, Nairobi Asian who ran a film school, said when he saw them how they, I unfortunately sometimes am quite long-winded in my scripts, huge chunks of English they had to learn, which they're not entirely comfortable with, learned them with no problem, and he said, well, I wish I had these people as actors rather than the spoiled middle-class people I have who spend the whole time asking me what their motivation would be. So these guys just do it. And talking to them, I said, how did doing this program work for you? And they said the first thing they did was they wanted to have a bit of space to set up an amateur dramatic society. And so they got together and they put together some sort of play, and then they went around asking and pestering all the people in authority in this slum, said, we need a space, give us a space, any space, we don't care. And eventually they said, okay, all right, have this shack here. And the shack was in actually rather a dangerous part of what is quite a dangerous slum. Anyway, so they decked out the shack, and they then said, well, this is great. And they built a gym beside it, which other people would go and pay to work in. This gym was like something out of Mad Max. It was literally lumps of concrete on scaffolding poles, bits of old tire, you pulled like that, full of guys who were quite frankly gangsters pumping on, but giving them a little bit of an income. They then decided that next door to them was a patch of ground. It was a sort of cut-through, which was famous for rape, murder, mugging. And they decided to, on their own bat, annex this piece of land and then turn it into something else they needed. They felt they didn't get enough vegetables, so they turned it into an urban farm. At the same time, they started to recycle some of the rubbish. You can recycle plastic, certain types of plastic, and they started to recycle this and earn a bit of money from that, from which they set up a security system around that part of the slum, including street lighting and sort of gates which were shut at night. All of this came from an artistic project. And all of this came from just someone saying, look, you can do this. You can, you want to, and what they did was they did sort of plays, but they also did acrobatics, which is quite popular in Nairobi, which they then go on tour with. Their acrobatic troupe, if they managed to get enough money or hitch a lift somewhere, they would go and do that. All of this came from a desire to express themselves, to tell the world something. And all the other bits of it sprouted from that, whether that was the recycling business or whether that was the urban farm. The idea that you could get together and do something and then you can do other things together as well was extremely important. At the end of the filming, one or two of them actually got sort of short scholarships to the film school run by the assistant director. They had taken control of their lives, and they had taken, they were using any opportunity they could get to do this. And in doing so, well, for the duration of when we were working with them, they got paid and fed, but they were able to do things that were quite extraordinary because they had found self-belief in themselves and had found a way of self-expression. When we'd finished that, we thought that other NGOs might like us to do this sort of film, which was, this was an opportunity for these guys. They seized it with two hands. They learned things they'd never done before, and there were some further opportunities that came out of it. So he said, well, maybe there are other NGOs who would like us to give this particular sort of film idea or dramatic idea that might help their clients. And we went to Oxfam, and they said, please do something with our Syrian refugees. Now, when we started going around getting money to do the Trojan women, everyone said, you're completely mad. There is no way that Arab women are going to be allowed by their husbands, brothers, fathers to go and stand on stage and act. Secondly, there is no tradition of adult amateur dramatics in the Middle East, so they won't understand what you want of them. So you're on a hiding to nothing. And we felt that that couldn't possibly be true, in that out of such a huge diaspora, there must be some people who wanted to become part of this project, even if it was only a dozen, which we originally thought it might be. Eventually, about 52 women turned up. We had to turn away 120. None of these women had ever been to a theatre before. I think two had been to a theatre before. None of them had ever acted before. What was the difference? What was the thing that made them want to be involved in this project? Because they weren't, as far as they knew, getting paid. We did actually give them a travel allowance, but it wasn't very much. And they were fed. So that was an attraction. But mostly it was, they were very isolated, and they had become marginalized. These weren't marginalized people in Syria. They had a place in society at whatever level, and they came from all walks of life. They had their home. They didn't need, in that way, to express themselves or to have their voice heard, because within their community, their voice was already heard. They may have their grumbles, they may have had their successes, but they had a place in society, and in a society they understood, and which worked for them. Now they've become the marginal people. The people, they had become a caste of people called refugees. who are just this horde of people you don't know what to do with, pain in the neck, you've got to feed them, they can't give to the economy because they're not allowed to work. And all of these women felt two things. One was that they had to have their voice heard. Suad, who actually had ambitions to be an actress, had said to me that, you know, every time she saw on television someone being interviewed from a suburb in Damascus about the fighting, she'd say, I wish a TV camera would come to our suburb and I would talk to them. And she said, this is what I felt I was doing. I was telling the world what had happened to us because there was no one to tell. Because normally you're in a situation where you talk to other people who are all having the same experience, or whatever it is, economic downturn or whatever it might be. But here they just had to get out of Syria, otherwise they'd be dead. And they were now lumped into this enormous group of people who were at the bottom of the pile, were marginalized, and who had no hope. Nothing they could say about their future was certain. And so they had become marginalized. And that was what had driven them to experiment with what we were offering, this drama therapy. Some of them actually brought along extremely depressed sisters and aunts who literally could not leave the tiny basement flats they were living in the slums. They were terrified of the local Jordanians who didn't particularly like the Syrians. They were terrified of just leaving the house. They all had PTSD, even if most of them didn't realize it. They then formed a community. And the community they formed was, and said, as one of them said, we're now the Trojan women. And they viewed their job really is this advocacy role, is this role of saying, we are speaking for the people who no one listens to. None of them would have been doing this if they hadn't been marginalized. And it's my belief that aside from the therapeutic value that that art brings to people, it was the feeling of being stifled, of having no one to hear you of importance, that had driven them to come to us. Likewise, following the Trojan Women, we did a radio soap opera called We Are All Refugees, and some of the women participated in that. And then last year we did Oliver in Arabic for their children, because can we do something with music and drama for our kids? And I thought, yeah, well, why not? I advise any of you to think twice before doing a musical. They're the Rubik's Cube of dramatic. Well, you can't fake the music, and it's extremely hard work. However, the kids who got involved, again, were in the Jordanian school system, but it's segregated. The Syrians go in the morning, the Jordanians go in the afternoon, the Jordanians don't like to talk to the Syrians. We wanted to get all of these people who lived in a very marginal part of Amman together in these 4 particular schools to be able to mix, as well as go through these things that they wouldn't normally do, which is dramatic exercises, musical exercises, which they all loved. And out of those 40 kids, we had a series of auditions, went on to work extremely hard and produce an amazing production of Oliver in Arabic. And 2 of the, Fadi, who played Oliver, was extremely shy, had an extremely difficult domestic life. I was told, I wasn't quite sure how it was, that he was beaten every day by his father, whose life had collapsed. He'd had a business in Syria, and now he couldn't do anything there. He worked illegally, occasionally fixing people's satellite dishes, and that was it. A man suffering from huge depression, and he took it out on his family, particularly on Fadi, who was extremely shy, but possessed of a beautiful voice. And by the end of it, he was asked by a journalist, he said, what does Oliver mean to you? And just to explain, when we went to Cameron McIntosh, who owns the rights to Oliver, he said, our director, Khalid Abul Naja, said, I'd like to update it to a modern Middle Eastern city. Cameron McIntosh said, no, look, I'm sorry, Lionel Bart's one stipulation was it had to always be in Dickensian London. And Cal said, look, most Middle Eastern cities are Dickensian London. And so he was then persuaded that we should do it. It's updated to a modern Middle Eastern city. And journalist said to Fadi, this little refugee kid, what does Oliver mean to you? How do you relate to this role of this 19th century kid? And he just said, Oliver's just like me, a kid struggling for his rights. And he completely identified with the Oliver of Dickens. And we've always tried to obviously match our drama to the circumstances of the people who are playing it, A, for therapeutic reasons, but B, because they always give extremely good performances. And I think this is because art is in many ways the way we make sense of the world, and always has been since its inception in various caves. And when you can't make sense of the world around you because it's changed, because your society has become broken, or because you are possibly marginalized from early life and don't understand why you're marginalized, art is a way of telling other people what's happening to you. And it's a way that they can consume, because it has a narrative, it has a structure whereby people can say, I understand this situation. What you've said has reached me because it's within a framework and a language I can understand, even though you're completely different from me, and even though I might despise you for your marginalization. So I'm finally going to say that one of the reasons that works is that we did the Trojan women with women who had very different attitudes towards the revolution amongst themselves. Some of them were for it, some of them were against it. And some of them wanted to make an anti-Assad protest, and the others didn't want them to, because not only because they didn't believe in it, but also they didn't want to be tarred with a brush and have something bad happen to their families back in Syria. And so this was a question of censorship. And the director said, I don't believe in censorship. Fine, but let me tell you one thing, that Euripides wrote this play about an Athenian war crime. And he wrote it and played it to the Athenians in the middle of an extremely bloody war, the Peloponnesian War, which went on for 30 years. This was in the 15th year of that war. Athens had sacked a little city-state, which was neutral, and killed the men and sold the women and children into slavery. The following year, Euripides wrote the Trojan women. He didn't write it about what had happened the year before. He used myth and a language that everyone understood. He made the Greeks, the traditional heroes, appalling people. And he focused on the women. And it was just the fact that they had, it was this metaphor that they could all understand. And it made them feel pity for the women of Troy, and by extension, the women of Milos, and guilt for what had happened to them. And this is what art or drama does. It allows people who are marginalized, it allows people to speak up either for them or to them to speak up themselves in a way that other people can understand, and it's done cleverly in a way that makes other people realize what they have perhaps by omission or commission allowed to happen to make these people marginalized. Okay, so that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Any comments? Yep, Julia?
And I wondered if you'd met prior to this panel, Eszter and William, and if you felt you'd learned anything from each other's similar experiences.
Yes, I certainly have. Listening to Eszter's extremely long struggle shows how important it is to keep the effort up, and how very, very difficult it is to access funding, how very difficult it is to produce something that is sustained to help people lift themselves out of poverty, or to help other people understand what has gone, what is happening to them. So yeah, I very much understood where she was coming from.
As far as I'm concerned, we've been entertaining the idea of doing drama in Budvatenke. And having heard these, what you said, I'm sure that we will do it because of the situation there. People are hurt. They're traumatized, not by war, but by their life circumstances. And that means that some of them can cope with it, some of them can't. And I'm sure that in addition to the usual power of art of expressing things that people may not want to hear or may not want to see, it will also have a healing power. So thank you.
Asha.
In India, we really struggle with raising money for the arts, whether it's CSR funds or, government funds or anything, because we're constantly told, like, why are you making them sing and dance? Give them clean drinking water, give them primary health, put them in school. So what are the strategies to negotiate fundraising for the arts in marginalized communities? Because it's, for us, it's a brick wall. So sometimes we say, okay, well, this is actually money for education, and then you sort of spin it into drama or but it's constant. Like, no, they don't need the arts, they need food and they need clean water, which is true. It's not false.
Well, if I may answer this, but they certainly do need clean water and food, but they also have a soul, and the soul needs food too, and it's just as much a need.
I, funnily enough, had this, I was talking to someone involved in Film Aid about this particular thing, and saying it's very hard to raise money for projects which are arts-based, because again, initially when we were raising money for the Trojan Women, you had a few people saying, well, I'll just buy, 10,000 blankets, surely that would be more useful. And, and there are plenty of actors who go and do this stuff, and directors who do this stuff, and they sort of go, I always feel slightly guilty because I'm not sure if it really works. So we actually engaged a psychiatrist when we were doing the original Trojan Women, and we always engage when we're doing a project. And he himself was a refugee from Damascus because the regime found out that he was giving psychiatric help to the rebels. He had to leave. He therefore was obviously dealing with PTSD and depression amongst refugees. There thing was called Syria Bright Futures, was a partnership with some Jordanian doctors, because obviously he couldn't practice on his own. He said it's like this. Out of 100% of refugees who go into a refugee camp, they come over the border and they go into a camp, the first processing site. 70% of them, as long as they're not about to be killed, being fed, and are under some form of shelter, they're happy. Not happy, but they're okay. 20% of them need something more than that. They need to have some form of psychiatric help to deal with the depression and PTSD which is going around and around in their head, the appalling things that have happened to them. And 10% of them, frankly, need one-to-one clinical help, which they're never going to get because it's too expensive for their refugees. What you're doing is absolutely right in terms of therapy for the 20% who are able to get something from this sort of group therapy. They form communities. They tell their stories to each other as well as to us. Their stories, we ask them to tell their stories to put it into the play so that it's, half Euripides and half, the stories of what's happened to them. This is very therapeutic in itself, as well as helpful advocacy. But what Ahmed, the psychiatrist said, the thing is that amongst the other 70% who thought they were okay, unless there is some form of therapy for them, they all will eventually migrate into the 10% of the top who need one-to-one clinical help. And that is because people realize at different stages of their life what has actually happened to them. And when they start to realize that they can't go home for the foreseeable future, and that in fact maybe a decade will pass with themselves in limbo, and the things that they've seen are starting to impinge upon their consciousness again, they need this. And so I was talking to an actor the other day who was saying, I'm never quite sure about whether these drama projects do any good. I said, they do good. We have evaluated our project. We've spoken to every single woman, well, my wife did, and got down exactly what they felt they had got out of it. We could see that they'd changed. They'd become, within 5 weeks, had become approximations of their own, had their own self-confidence come back. And they, that's primarily how they benefited from it. So we could see that this works, and it's really important because you can have the situation, which is the one I heard somewhere about after the tsunami about 2 years later. There were these fishermen who were still scared to go back to the sea and earn their living and relying on UN HCR handouts. And they couldn't function as people. We all have to go out and do something. We all have to feel part of a community. We all have to work. And what these women felt they'd got was that they'd got that part of them back, which allowed them to stand up in the world and say, and take their place in it. So it does work, and it's incredibly important.
Can I make a comment onto your question? I work with William, and indeed I'm married to him. And one, I absolutely know what you're talking about, because it's extremely difficult. It's blood from a stone getting money for the arts and this, and we use a lot of emotional blackmail. But the thing that took our project to a different level and helped is because we then used it as a strategic communications project, we ruthlessly PR'd everything we did. We were able to say, yes, we're doing a play, but it's not just our play with these people. By making a huge song and dance about it, we're then emotionally blackmailing millions of people to give money for the clean water and the blankets. And that was the way it worked from that point of view.
May I also add one more point here? Our major fight is against social exclusion. And that requires people to be brought together. You can fight prejudice by letting people get to know one another. Through having created something unique in the world, because as one of the painters, Zoran Tajrovic of Serbia, said, Budvatenke is important because through it, Roma art, living with us for centuries, invisible, has become visible for the world to see. And that draws people there, people who would never otherwise meet. So I think, and that was the argumentation with which we did manage to get the funding for the artistic part. And we can now say that Budvatenke, if we could manage to invite 2 more Roma painters, Lita Cabelut from Spain and Gabi Jimenez from France, then we could say that Budvatenke presents a valid cross-section of contemporary European Roma art. But with these 2 exceptions, we already have that. There's nothing like this in the world anywhere. So, and it's reflected also in the communications achievement of the project, because BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Reuters, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Saudi Gazette, you name it, there's no, almost no medium of any fame that would not have reported on the project.
I have a question to William. I had the chance to see your film, The Queens of Syria, and I was really touched with like how you really managed to show the story of these women, of their struggle, how they were trying to overcome their culture, their like society, like all these barriers that they have, also like themselves to be able to perform, and how many women left, like they couldn't reach the final point. I just wonder, what was the response of the audience when this was finally, like at the first day when it was performed? And how did women feel after, how did they feel after having done this, like at the stage? Like, because it's really like, I think it's really empowering what they did, not only for themselves, but also for other women. And you also said that art is really like powerful way to deliver your message, like to tell your story. But also, like, here's my second question. Like from the previous panel, we discussed that it's not always easy to make your message to really reach and to really disclose what you want to say, because like sometimes it's just not understood. And I just wonder, like from your experience, have you learned anything about like kind of the art, how art can actually do this, how a message should be framed to be able to reach the audience and to disclose the story the way women or like other people, marginalized people feel about like how they want to say it, to reflect?
Yeah, so that's a two-part question. How the women felt about doing this and their participation. There were some early drop-offs of women who either didn't want to really participate fully, possibly there for slightly, not the wrong reasons, because, you know, sitting at the back, you know, eating the free biscuits and tea is a perfectly valid thing to do. But they didn't want to become necessarily involved in this. It's hard work, you know. They were doing exercises, they were being given this sort of crash course in how to open up and become an actor, about how to do these things. They also had to act out various scenarios about their own stories, about, say, when their brother was killed or what happened, which was also traumatic. And some of them didn't want to do that. Some of them were stopped by their male relatives. There was one who was absolutely not allowed by her husband to go at all and become involved at all. And she just said, I nagged and nagged and nagged and nagged and nagged, and I got there. Now, she wasn't then going to not end up doing the performance, and she carried on and did it. There were some who felt they had to go because of the risk to relatives held by the regime in Syria, and so there were various reasons that people didn't go on stage. Some of them didn't want to be filmed for the documentary. Some of them on stage wore a niqab they didn't normally usually wear. Some did wear the niqab. It very much their own reasons. They did it at risk. There's very unknown quantity how this play would be viewed, and this is why it was very important for me that it remained this extremely powerful metaphor that Euripides had used, and I have to hand all credit to Euripides for this rather than us. He provided a framework and a way of understanding and dealing with this refugee problem. Well, then they're about to be sold into slavery, but the thing is the same. They've been displaced from their homes, and all of the women absolutely identified with Euripides' play when it was first shown to them, just translated into Demotic Arabic. They all said, I'm Hecuba, I'm Andromache, I'm Cassandra. None of them said they were Helen of Troy, but, for reasons we won't go into. But they all understood this was something that absolutely went to their heart. They knew the myth of Troy. They had never read this play before. So the second part of your question, I think I now have forgotten, which was about Well, it was very much, first of all, there were two things. First of all, we didn't really know that what we were doing just wouldn't come across as a sort of slightly elevated school play, i.e. an amateur dramatic production. We engaged a very good director, Syrian director, Omar Abu Sada, who brought with him a team of 2 women, a sonographer and an actor's trainer. And he produced with these women a work of visual stunningness and visceral emotional power. And that was part him and part the women. But the point is, what we've always tried to do is to join the advocacy and the communication side of it with the therapeutic side of it. So that we've always hoped or tried to produce something that is of international artistic value with a cast of marginalized people. And so that the communication, as my wife said, it's very simple. Syrian refugee has horrid time in refugee camp is not news. Syrian refugee puts on stunning performance of Euripides' most famous play is news because it's very unexpected. Added to that, the visual power of it and the design of it, which was designed to look like a Syrian funeral, meant that visually it was very exportable in terms of stills photography. And it actually was Reuters' photograph of the week at the time, was a picture of the women at the moment when they're like that. So, yeah, it's very important, the communication aspect of this. It's very important. When we did Oliver, we were on CNN. The last, Christiane Amanpour's, the last 10 minutes of her hour on refugees, of course, at the height. That was in the beginning of September last year. So we had 10 minutes of Oliver, and they said, these are refugees in other circumstances, not crossing the sea, not tramping up railway tracks. These are people doing something that you might do or go and see. That's very important. It's very important to distinguish from the mass of people. These are people like you, and there is a golden rule in life. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. And Euripides made the Athenians feel for the Trojan women, and therefore feel guilty for what they'd done to the Melians the year before.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up here, but we have lunch upstairs and a conversation with Issam Korbaj, whose installation is on show on the first floor. So do join us for lunch and to hear more about Issam's work. Okay, thank you.